This video is going to be about the bibliography of works, all the stuff I read and watched as I worked on this comics biography of Muhammad Ali. It's actually not all the stuff I read and watched, it's sort of like the big ones. There's about 1,000,000 articles and short videos and interviews and stuff that aren't in here. There's probably going to be enough stuff. But anyway, let's just look at some of the resources that went into the research for this project. I'm going to do this sort of chronologically. I think I grew up in the 90s, like many people of my generation. I think When We Were Kings was kind of a big moment for Muhammad Ali. I would say he came back into the public consciousness at that time. I think he's ubiquitous. Everyone's heard of him, but I think he was more on the radar around the time his documentary came out. So this one's about the Rumble in the Jungle. It's about when he reclaimed the heavyweight championship title after it was taken from him by the United States government in a big upset fight. Spoiler alert, but he beats George Foreman in Africa and becomes a heavyweight champion for the second time. It's kind of the high point of his whole career, I would say. So this documentary is pretty much wholly focused on that time. And I watched this, I don't know, in the early 2000s, I think. So, just because it was a famous documentary, because it was interesting. So I would say this was a little bit my introduction to Muhammad Ali. And I watched it again later as I was researching and took notes and stuff. When I think about my personal history with Muhammad Ali, this is kind of the start. And I'd say that's probably true of many people my age. And then in about 2009 was when I had the idea of making a comics biography, Muhammad Ali, and I have other videos that are about where that decision came from. But the first thing I did was I bought this book. Probably, I don't know I think I just went to the bookstore and this was there. It looked interesting. So this is David Remnick's book about Muhammad Ali, and it really is pretty focused on the early years. And that was the thing I would come to notice as I worked my way through these books, is that he's such a large subject that many works about him are focused on a specific period. So this is kind of just right around the time he becomes the heavyweight champion for the first time, leading up to that fight with Sonny Liston, and a little bit of stuff afterwards, and then some really cool stuff that takes place in the 90s, where when he's older, some interactions between David Remnick and Ali. But I think that reading this book really kind of immediately won me over to Ali as a subject. There were certain moments. It's so rare that this happens, but there's a moment in the book from when he's 12 where he wins his first sparring match ever, and he wins by decision, and he declares he's the greatest to the audience, which is maybe a little bit of a selective memory type of a thing, but I remember reading that and being like, that would be the end of the first chapter. The first chapter he'd be 12, and that would be the end of it. And it's so rare that something that you think of in your initial read through of your first thing actually makes it to the final thing, but that is in fact how I end the first chapter of this book. And also it has moments like when, in the lead up to his fight with Sonny Liston, he drives a bus up to his house at like 2 in the morning and is calling him out with a bullhorn, like mocking him, and it's just to mess with him, stuff like that, where the personality of Ali, who's Cassius Clay at that time, is just so compelling. So that was one of the things that really made me feel pretty strong that he'd be a very good subject for a comics biography. So then I had heard about this documentary as it was being worked on. I know someone I know knows Bill Siegel, who made this. And it was originally going to have no fights in it at all. It was just about the political challenges that Ali went through around his refusal to fight in Vietnam, and that to me sounded very interesting. And then it does have some fight footage and some stuff around that too, but it's essentially focused on the politics around Ali. And to me, that was the most interesting stuff initially. That was what really drew me to him as a subject. So I saw this in the theater when it came out. It was probably like 2012-ish. I can't tell you exactly when it came out, but I saw it in the theater when it came out. I went and saw it, and I think this was the thing, kind of reminded me that I had this idea and really pushed me further in wanting to make this. And Bill Siegel, actually, who made this, I had a few opportunities to talk with him and meet with him. He was really supportive, and he pointed me towards some resources. I'll talk a little bit more about that as I get to him. And he unfortunately passed away in the last couple of years. I actually went to his funeral. But this is a great, great work. This, to me, is up there with When We Were Kings. Like, this is a really wonderful representation of Muhammad Ali and what he achieved in his life and career. So one of the first books I read was Dave Zirin's What's My Name, Fool, which is not specifically about Ali. It talks about him, but it also just talks about political opposition throughout sports history, which was a larger subject I needed to look into when working on this book. And so it just created kind of larger context within the world of sports for me about what it meant, what Ali did, and just some other examples, and some things like, the Black Power salute and the 1968 Olympics by Tommy Smith and John Carlos, which is mentioned in my book, which you kind of have to mention if you're going to make a book about Ali, I believe, and sort of how he had a domino effect on politics and sports, I would say, which is, I think, still felt today. Like someone like Colin Kaepernick, I think, is, not that he wouldn't have taken the stance he did if it hadn't been for Muhammad Ali, but that Muhammad Ali kind of created that precedent. And just what it means to be a public figure and make a statement with your fame and notoriety, which is something I think Ali deserves such admiration for. So then, one of the first books I read was Muhammad Ali's Autobiography, which, if I could do this over again, I would probably have read it later, because he didn't actually write it. Richard Durham wrote it. And it's a very weird mixed bag. A lot of it's not true, is what's happening. And Ali didn't even read this book, actually. I don't think he even knew a lot of what was in there. But it also has some really interesting stuff that is true. It has a transcription of a conversation with his first wife, which I think he had to include in the book. That has a lot of their story in their own words, and it has a few things like that. So it has this sort of stuff you can cherry pick that's really great sources, but it's also so mixed in with like a fictionalization and a self-mythology of Muhammad Ali. And so I ended up, having read this early on, I had to do a lot of work to sort of figure out what was true and what wasn't. A lot of the popular myths of Muhammad Ali came from this book and from the movie adaptation of it, which many people don't even know is a thing, but Muhammad Ali actually played himself in a movie. He did a bio movie where he played himself, which is, again, like very blatantly untrue and in some really weird ways. So it tells a version of his story, a very one that's not very careful with the facts, I would say. And this, and, later I would watch the Will Smith, Michael Mann movie, too, which is, I would say, not a great movie. These movies, I would say, were part of what made me feel like a comics biography was a really particularly good way to tell this story, because it definitely does not work in a 3-act structure. Like, this Will Smith movie tells such a small amount of the story of Muhammad Ali, because he just had so many ups and downs and such a long and varied career that you just can't really capture it in a traditional movie narrative structure. You can maybe do like a 12-part series or something. But Bill Siegel told me that the director's commentary on this is really good. Actually, it's something I keep meaning to watch. But anyway, I watched this, but I didn't love it. That's what I'll say. So then I read things like the Muhammad Ali Reader and the Mammoth Book of Muhammad Ali, and these are compilations of articles and writings from the time, which I think were really crucial, largely because the narrative around Muhammad Ali got really rewritten around the second time he won the championship, around 1974. And it's important to read things that were written about him at the time in the 60s when he was in exile and even when he was first vying for the championship title, because people hated his guts. He was a really controversial figure, and his boasting and all those things were really unprecedented and controversial at the time. And it's, for me at least, it's a little hard to recognize that now because, I mean, I'm not bothered by him saying how great he is, but a lot of people were. In 1962, it was not, it was frowned upon for a black man to do that. So this just helped create that context, and it was really necessary to show these events at the time, how they were perceived. So there's a lot of writing in these works that really underscored that, because like I said, once you get to 1974-ish, he becomes this sort of beloved mainstream figure, and it really flips the script on him a lot. This book, Bill Siegel recommended to me. He said, if you're going to do this, you got to read this book. This really frames a lot of the politics around this story really well, and I strongly agree with him. This was one of the great works I read, and one of the things that really influenced how I wanted to tell this story, and told me some things that I came to see as really crucial in telling this story. And particularly, I would say this book outlines what black heavyweight champions had to deal with historically. Like, it tells the story of Jack Johnson, who was a very non-establishment champion, who kind of refused to adhere to ways he was treated by white people, essentially, like societal rules and things like that. And he got crushed. I mean, he got essentially a law was invented to put him in jail, and he was taken down by the system. And then you have Joe Louis later, who sort of did everything that the system asked him to do, and he was still ruined at the end. So it kind of outlines these two paths. You can either adhere to the system, or you can push back against it. And if you are a black heavyweight champion, historically, both paths lead you to not a happy ending. So that was crucial to me too, in the way that Ali sort of recognized that and pushed back against it. There's a quote from the period where he refuses to fight in Vietnam, and he says, I'm given this choice or this choice, and there is another alternative. And that was such a strong statement to me. There is another alternative. And that was specifically about whether or not he would fight in Vietnam, but I saw that too as being about these very limited choices he was given in his life about how he would end up. So then Blood Brothers is really particularly focused on the relationship between Muhammad Ali and Malcolm X. It's just a whole book about it, and there's a lot to understand there, and this was kind of a deep dive on that, and it's crucial. It's important to understand that relationship. Malcolm X is in the book. He's not in a lot, the book I'm working on, but I spent a lot of time thinking about how to tell that part of the story and what's crucial and what are the facts, really sticking to the facts. And Malcolm X is not someone who you can put words in his mouth. So this book was a pretty important resource for that. And like the struggle between Elijah Muhammad and Malcolm X, and how Cassius Clay at the time was in the middle of that, and what he was and wasn't aware of. It's just a really important part of this overall story. So then this book, Thomas Hauser's Biography, is such a great book. I would say more than anything, what I'm trying to do is create a comics equivalent of this book. Like, this is a thing that if you're going to read one thing about Muhammad Ali and really know the story and what it means and the ins and out of it, this is the book. It's kind of an oral history. It's a lot of interviews with people who were there. Muhammad Ali participated in the creation of the book. It's a lot of things are his own words. And part of why I made a comics biography is because not a ton of people are going to read this, 500-600 page biography. I think everyone should, but I don't know if everyone will. But if I was going to adapt the book I made from a singular source, this would be it. Like, this is, top recommendation, really deep look at the life and times of Muhammad Ali. And then this book, Jonathan Ives' Ali biography, another big thick one. That's the other one that's sort of a one-stop shop for the Muhammad Ali story. And this book came out right at the very end of my research cycle. I wrote 3 drafts of my script before I submitted it to an editor. And I think I had finished the second draft and read this before the third draft. So it had some stuff I stuck in, but it's also, and I interviewed everyone. He did an amazing job of really finding ways of interviewing a lot of people who would refuse to be interviewed a million times. And he finds a bunch of different takes on things, like alternate quotes and accounts of things. And he does a really good job of describing the fights, too. So this book, it was an important resource, but I read it at the end too, so it was kind of, I got to a point at the end where I was like, okay, I've read this story 30 times, So, but it did have some things I really cherry picked. And also, I was also very supportive of this book. I've met with him a few times and talked with him, and he's been really great and big supporter of this book. So Jonathan Ives is a friend of my Ali biography, and I'd recommend this book too. This is another one where if you want to read one singular thing, this'll do it. This will give you a pretty rounded view of the life and times of Muhammad Ali. And then the other one is a documentary series, Muhammad Ali, the whole story. This is one that David Walker is a comics writer, and I talked to him about this project. He was like, oh, you got to watch this. So I watched it. This was also right at the end, and this was another one where I was like, okay, I watched a 5-hour documentary. I got maybe 3 minutes of new information from it because I had just read the story so many times at that point. So that was kind of like towards the end for me, where I was like, okay, I really think I've got this covered. I've done the research. But this, again, if you want to just watch one thing, this is like a 5-hour documentary or something, but it pretty much is the whole story. It does a good job. Norman Mailer's book, The Fight, covers the same period that's covered in When We Were Kings, the Rumble in the Jungle, and he was there. So he hung out with Muhammad Ali at this time and kind of creates an account of what happened. And this book, I thought, honestly, was kind of terrible. I thought a lot about being a white author and telling this story, and I think Norman Mailer really tells you a lot about what not to do. Like, there's like a long aside in the middle of the book about his attitudes about black people, which are not very positive, and it's like, maybe you shouldn't be telling this book. And the way that he writes Ali's dialogue and things, it feels weird. I mean, and this came out in the 70s, but you couldn't even make this book now. But at the same time, it has a few scenes that are pretty crucial. He's in the locker room with Ali right before he goes out to fight George Foreman, and that scene only really exists in this book if you're gonna recreate it as comics. So again, I was cherry picking stuff from different things. So I would only read this book for research purposes. This is the second autobiography that Muhammad Ali wrote. He wrote it with his daughter, and it's just a really kind of sweet, quick read, and it's just a lot of it really captures him later in his life, which I think is important, in which there's not enough attention paid to this sort of reflective soul that he became, and just ways he looked back on his life, and just some moments too, like this dream he has that is in my book, and just some nice reflections, and a little bit of just like a portrait of who he was for the last decades of his life, which are not, I don't feel like, discussed enough or examined enough or seen in a positive enough light, I would say. Here's another documentary about his early years in Miami. There's a lot of good footage that I used for reference, and just kind of a deep dive. A lot of these are kind of a deep dive to a specific period, is what a lot of this stuff is. Here's some Muhammad Ali Parkinson Center's 100 questions and answers about Parkinson's disease. So this is one of those ones where I read a whole book to write like a single scene. But one thing that bothers me about the larger story of Muhammad Ali is people don't understand what Parkinson's disease is, how it works, and how it affects the body and how it affects the mind. So I read this book, and I read it to essentially just write a scene where a doctor is describing Parkinson's disease. But there's a lot of things people need to know that they don't know. Muhammad Ali, his mind was fine for the whole last part of his life. He knew where he was and who he was and what he was doing. It affects the body, not the mind. And that's something that I think is very important. And also, it's totally unclear whether boxing had anything to do with it at all. Like, many people who have Parkinson's disease were not the heavyweight champion of the world. And it may have occurred for completely unrelated reasons. So that is one thing I personally wanted to do, was reframe that a little bit, or just give the audience more information than I think they're usually provided about what it was like for Muhammad Ali to live with Parkinson, and what it meant for him, and what his life was like, and who he was for the last decades of his life. So the Autobiography of Malcolm X is, I had actually read this before I did this research, but I reread it for this book. Because this is a book everyone should read. This should be required reading for everyone. It's one of the great works in the English language. So this was just, again, to get a fuller portrait of Malcolm X and to inform things he says in the book. You know, like I said, I was really careful not to use any language that was not his own, and to kind of represent him as he would represent himself was really my intention. I did that as well as I could. And that this has some pretty pivotal scenes and says some things about the relationship between Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, and the very unfortunate conclusion of their relationship. So this was in there, and then I also read Book of Speeches. This is one of the cases where I read a whole book to, that became like half a page in the book, but I wanted Malcolm X to be giving a speech when we meet him in the book that I made. So I read a bunch of his speeches, and I kind of had to pick something he'd be saying when we meet him. So I'm pretty sure it came from this book. I might have found it somewhere else. It might have been actually from his autobiography. I'd have to look it up. But again, it's always good to read speeches by Malcolm X. He's one of the great speakers, and he had some really important things to say. The Black Muslims in America is essentially research about the Nation of Islam that was written at the time, and this sort of gave a lot of background and context, or describes what their meetings were like and things like that. So it provided a lot of resources just for how to recreate these scenes and the culture of this organization. So this was essential too. This is one of those books where, like, you can't make this book without reading this, I would say. And then I read Elijah Muhammad's Manifesto. This was kind of the book that convinced a lot of people to join the Nation of Islam. And again, Elijah Muhammad was another person that I didn't want to write dialogue for him. I didn't feel capable of, or that it was appropriate. So most of what he says is really from this book, or from quotes by him. But it really just lays out his beliefs and his the values and beliefs of his organization, and how he exists as the head of that. So this, again, was just very little of the content makes it into the book that I made, but it's just a lot of times you have to know a lot before you can write a little, I would say. So that's what this was too. This is just something I felt like I had to read in order to talk about the Nation of Islam or Elijah Muhammad in a book. And then here's another one, Marcus Garvey. I think there's one panel where Cassius Clay and Malcolm X are talking about Marcus Garvey. Both of their dads were very influenced by Marcus Garvey. And the Nation of Islam is sort of like a second generation American influence of a lot of ideas that Marcus Garvey presented. This was another case where I read a whole bunch of stuff, and I think one sentence from this makes it in the book or something, but it was just background and context for what I had written. Same with Voices of Freedom, an oral history of the civil rights movement. The story of Emmett Till is in the first chapter of the book that I made, and I use this for that. And just context for what was happening at the time. Cassius Clay and the Nation of Islam actually didn't even participate in the civil rights movement, which is something that's not mentioned a lot. Like, I think Muhammad Ali is described as a civil rights figure, but they were opposed to integration. They saw the civil rights movement as a push to be approved of by white America, and they didn't want white America's approval. They wanted their own thing, and I think not for no reason. Anyway, so this just gave some more background and context, and I think this was cited in David Remnick's book. It was one of the resources he used, and I think that was part of what kind of made me think that I should check this out. So then I read a lot of autobiographies of people who show up in the book. So Ali's brother, who's Rudy growing up, and he's Rahman later, wrote, this is not a great book. It is one of those like self-published books where it didn't have an editor or anything. It actually has a lot of remembered accounts of things that are different in every other source and things like that. And it's not a great book, but it has some cool insight, and it has a lot of really good photos, and it has like paintings by their dad and things like that. So it had some pretty good resources in it, but it's not the best book. Some more books by people who were there. So Ferdy Pacheco and also Angelo Dundee, both their autobiographies are called like My View from the Corner or A View from the Corner, which I think is weird. Anyway, and again, it just gave further background on them, who they were, how they saw these events, what it was like for them, and just dialogue too. Angelo Dundee says, beat the bejabbers. He beat the bejabbers out of that guy. I read that. I was like, definitely using that. So, just more background and context, and just ways to make sort of secondary figures more well-rounded, more three-dimensional. This one, Running with the Champ, by Tim Shanahan. This is just a guy who was friends with Muhammad Ali, who wrote a memoir about hanging out with him. And it gives a lot of context, and it provides a lot of scenes and moments, like a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff, some really cool private moments, and it's later in his life, too, which, again, is not covered very well. So it just gave a lot of insight to kind of who he was privately, and what it was like to just hang out with him. So I was surprised, actually, by how important this book became to my research, because I almost didn't read it. It looked kind of like Muhammad Ali was so famous that if you hung out with him, you could write a popular book. So think about that. But I thought, yeah, it was a pretty good resource. Smokin' Joe Frazier's autobiography, which again was written collaboratively. This I thought was important to read. Again, just padding out history and context of Joe Frazier, who he was, and that he's such a unique character in this story too, because he's like the only really sympathetic opponent of Muhammad Ali. I think he's like the only guy that manages to be the person you feel bad for when he's up against Ali. Like, Ali doesn't come off well in their rivalry. So I thought that was very interesting. And it's some phrases he uses and just ways that he saw the whole thing, the very justifiable resentment he felt towards Muhammad Ali is really discussed in this book, and it's an important thing to acknowledge in this story. And then Layla Ali is one of Muhammad Ali's many kids, wrote this memoir, and she wrote it when she was like 25 or something. It's very interesting to read a very young person's autobiography. But again, it has some pivotal moments that are only available in this book. That I didn't really try to get into the personal life of the family. I reached out to a few of his kids, and nobody wrote me back. And I think they've been contacted 10 billion times their whole life. So I wasn't going to push. And there's enough content already, and also that's their private family life. So I really didn't. I learned some things from talking to other biographers and things like that. Some personal business that I will not share, but it wasn't my. I wasn't interested in creating like an expose about his family or anything. So I really, because this book was published and this information was offered up, I used it as a resource, but that was really it. I kind of kept it brief, the stuff about his family and his kids, because I think that's how they wanted it. Then there's a few more documentaries. I Am Ali is a really good documentary. I like this one, and it has some phone calls between him and his kids. He would call his daughters and record it. He archived all these conversations he had with them, and there's just a few of them in this movie that I was really affected by. They're really telling, I thought. So this is another, it's a pretty good documentary. And those are the ones I have listed for this slideshow. Again, there was many other resources. There's a bunch of articles and like a 2020 special, and then just stuff I really went deep on. Like in the first chapter, there's some discussion about the West End in Louisville where he grew up, and I read this long article about that, and I went there and talked to locals and things. So there's like a lot of deep dives on, and sometimes on minutia, looking up types of cars that people would be driving and stuff. But these are kind of the big ones. This is the obvious bibliography without citing a bunch of articles and stuff, but a lot of New York Times articles and interviews and things like that too throughout it. So that is just to provide a basic overview of what was compiled to make this book. The comics biography I wrote and am drawing, to me, is sort of a collage of all these sources. So I just kind of pulled from all these sources and kind of figured out what was essential in each of them and tried to put it all together into one cohesive comics biography, and we'll see how it goes. So thanks for watching this, and please support this project. There's links in the bio to the Patreon, and I hope you're having a great day. All right, thanks very much.